Okay, welcome back to Read 516. Our first portion of the lecture was just going over the forum discussions, what's coming up for your sessions, and some upcoming assignments. Now we're going to move on to the meat of our lecture, which includes foundations of literacy and our early literacy assessments. Okay, so with our session objectives, we are going to describe and explain early literacy skills, which, like I mentioned before, it's just my umbrella term to include oral language development, word learning, phonological awareness, concept of print, alphabet recognition. So we'll be touching lightly on some of these areas. And we're also going to look at some of your assessments that you can give for early literacy skills. Let me go back really quick. Um, these are some of the things that I did go over in class, but I kind of wanted to remind you about what you can do with your student. Okay, so we're first going to cover our language foundations of early literacy, and this is chapter 7 in your Lipson and Wixon. So we're going to kind of go back to the week 3 readings, and the reason that I'm doing this is because I'm finding that once you work with your student in class, and by the time the student leaves, I only have about 30 minutes with you, and so I feel that that 30 minutes would be most useful is going over the assessments in details and answering any questions you might have. So that leaves me with a long lecture for you guys to have online. So anyways, going back to our language foundations. Learning to read and write are highly correlated with oral language competence. So think about the oral language competence and how a child develops, acquires language. So oral language lays the foundation for reading and writing. So reading and writing are language based, and writing and oral language are used to communicate ideas. So if a student or if a child has a strong foundation in oral language, then chances of their success with reading and writing are very high. Children must learn the subsystems of language, such as phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. So phonology is the study of speech. Morphology is how words are formed. Syntax refers to the pattern structure of word order, so kind of like the grammatical rules of a language. Semantics is the meaning in language, so an analysis of words, phrases, and sentences. And pragmatics are social cues, so the use of language in context. So for a child, it might be learning to make eye contact when someone is speaking or when you're talking to someone. A child learning how to respond to questions or adjusting their speech for different situations. Okay, so how do children acquire language? So determine that auditory sounds are meaningful. So think if you have a kid or if you're been around babies, they don't just immediately start talking, obviously. So they have to understand that auditory sounds are meaningful. They need to learn how to express their intentions with language. So how to name objects, how to make changes of meaning. So here they're learning how to change the car to cars, like adding the S. And once students, or I shouldn't just say students, once children start experimenting with language, sometimes you see over generalization. So they might say like walk it, or they might call a dog, basically any animal they might call a dog, or if they learn the word plane and then they start referring to anything in the air as plane. And children also must know rules for mapping meaning into words, so grammar and syntax. All right, so the big two in literacy are phonology and vocabulary and word knowledge. And the reason why these are the big two is because the development of these two are significantly related to reading and writing success. So one of the reasons we are going to be discussing phoneme awareness and why we should assess it, because it shows there's a strong correlation with if a student has strong phonemic awareness, then they most likely will have success in early reading, but not necessarily later. But this is highly correlated with early reading, and vocabulary and word knowledge is highly correlated with reading comprehension. And I think I might have that coming up. And okay, so learning words, and yes, I do. So phonology is important to early reading, but vocabulary is a better predictor of later reading achievement. Okay, so our first words that a child learns are more about phonology than semantics. So remember, semantics are meaning, so the first words are mostly sounds. So kind of like when they're babbling, like ba 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 ba. So they're learning to play with sounds, or they might be mimicking a sound. At 10 months, they develop an understanding of word meaning. First words are typically statements, so usually most of them are nouns. Then enter the holophrastic and telegraphic stages of production. And we'll go into these in more details with the next slide. Okay, so stages of language acquisition, and we can thank Dr. Bowers for this. She's the one who gave me this slide. This is from, let me think back, 516 linguistics, I think, or 514, I don't know, one of those 500 classes. But anyways, so these are the stages that a child will go through. So we start with the cry, which is the pre-linguistic stage, and the coo. And then we have the babble, which is considered linguistic because because they're playing with sound. So then we come to our first words, and usually they're one word, like play, car, duck, mom. And again, typically these tend to be nouns. So then moving forward, we go on to our holophrastic stage, or two words. And so these are have very simple somatic relations, such as mommy walk, mom cookie, like give me cookie, or I should say two words, so where they're missing a chunk, but you can maybe still gather meaning from it. And then our last stage, which is the telegraphic, which kind of reminds me of a telegram, which basically means like there's just enough information. So maybe a child might say what her name, or mommy give me cookie, or just so there's just enough information to get the meaning across. Okay, so continuing with word learning. At 18 months, children begin to add vocabulary. Once they hit 50 words, many experience a spurt, and the rate of acquisition speeds up more. By age 3, children have typically accumulated 1,000 words. Now, this may not be the case for all children, and this really depends on the environment that they are growing up in. So this statistic is based on a middle-class family. And lastly, they also begin to acquire the concept of word. Okay, so if you are going to assess your oral language with your student, there are various assessments, and they are listed on your practicum assessment guide. You can use the TROLL, and this is the Teacher Rating of Oral Language and Literacy. And all I did was I Googled this and I got this link. So if you were to look that up, let's see, hold on. you would see something like this. And I will admit that I am not very familiar with this, but I do want to just make sure that you know about it. It's pretty lengthy in terms of describing it and giving the research behind it. I know they did some research on the reliability and validity of the assessment, but I think that if you were to actually use this with a student that you were going to be having year long, this can provide a lot of information about their oral language development. So let me scroll down here. So here is something you might try. How would you describe this child's willingness to start a conversation with adults and peers and continue trying to communicate when he or she is understood on the first attempt? So again, like this would be definitely challenging to assess your student with your session, but this can be definitely useful with some students in your classroom if you notice something with their oral language. So just want to make sure you have that resource available. Oops. Okay, so also there is a oral language checklist, and you can just definitely make your own as well. And this is actually in your Lipson and Wixon that you can refer to. You can interview the child and just listen for listen for certain things, but you definitely want to look at the oral language checklist in the Lipson and Wixon so you know exactly what to look for. So some of the things you might look for are, can you hear them? Are they expressive? Do they have trouble saying certain sounds? Do they speak in complete sentences? Are they fragment sentences? You might want to attend to their vocabulary. Is it rich? Is it varied? Is it very simple? What kind of, what are their pragmatics like? So pragmatics, I remember, as I mentioned before, is social, kind of social cues. Do they use their hands to talk? I know I use my hands very often, and I think I'm actually using my hands right now. Facial expressions, just things like that. So I definitely, if you were going to give the oral language assessment, I would definitely take a look in your Lipson and Wixon book for more details on what to look for. You can also look at writing samples. I find that this is very useful, especially when they're in kinder and first grade. It really gives you some insight to what their speech is like. It's very, their oral language and their reading and their writing, they're all very, what's the word I'm looking for? I'm drawing a blank right now. I'm sorry. It's really late. They're highly correlated. So what you see with reading, if they are struggling with reading, it's very common that they are also struggling with writing. And there's also an oral language assessment in Titanium. Okay, and I'm going to stop right there.